This is Aleister Crowley, a wealthy British occultist, celebrated author, and philosopher whose face literally appears on the Beatles' S.G.D. Pepper's album cover. He must be living his best life as a respected spiritual leader, right? Wrong. Because on December 1st, 1947, this 72-year-old man dies alone in a seaside boarding house called Netherwood Broke, sick and still addicted to heroin after decades of use. But that's not even the creepiest part. The creepiest part is what happens exactly 24 hours later. You see, Crowley's doctor, William Brown Thompson, had refused to keep prescribing him morphine in his final days. So the enraged Crowley reportedly cursed the doctor on his deathbed. And guess what? Dr. Thompson was found dead in his bathtub the very next day, within 24 hours of Crowley's death. Coincidence? Now, you might be wondering, why would someone so influential, so famous, end up dying in obscurity while his final act is apparently cursing his own doctor to death? Well, in his own words, Crowley wrote, "Before man is ready to accept the law of Thelema, the whole planet must be bathed in blood." Weird flex, but okay. But even after his death, his funeral was so scandalous, with followers reciting his hymn to Pan, that newspapers called it a black mass, and the local council banned any similar ceremonies from ever happening again. The Aleister Crowley you know from occult bookstores and rock album covers, that's only half the story. The real one is much darker and way more disturbing. You don't want to miss this. To know how he ended up in that boarding house with a dead doctor and a band funeral, we'll have to go back just a little bit. 72 years earlier, in 1875, Edward Alexander Crowley was born at a very young age into a wealthy family in England. His parents were members of the Plymouth Brethren, an extreme evangelical Christian sect that was basically religious fundamentalism on steroids. His father, Edward Crowley, was a traveling preacher whom young Aleister actually adored and respected. For once, a happy childhood. But gentlemen, life moves on. And when Aleister was only 11 years old, his father died of cancer. The loss devastated the boy and marked a turning point in his life that would haunt everything he did from that moment forward. From that point on, he was raised by his widowed mother and her ultra-religious relatives. And this is where things get dark. You see, young Aleister started rebelling hard. He would commit small acts of blasphemy just to shock his pious mother. And at some point during one of his childhood transgressions, his mother, Emily Crowley, called her own son the Beast 666, after the monster in the biblical book of Revelation. She meant it as an insult, equating her child with the Antichrist. But here's the twist. The nickname thrilled the boy. He loved it. He reportedly reveled in being called the Beast and later adopted it as one of his official titles. Now you're probably wondering, how does this kid go from being called the Antichrist by his own mother to literally defining modern occultism and having his face on one of the most famous album covers of all time? Well, stick around because it gets way darker from here. Years later, Crowley would write his autobiography that he felt constantly oppressed by strict Christian notions of sin and virtue. He said he instinctively sided with the devil over God, reasoning that if Christian morality had made his family miserable, then he would ally with the opposing force. In his own words, "My first step must be to get into personal communication with the devil. I devoted myself to black magic." So basically, childhood religious trauma turned into a lifelong obsession with literally becoming the Antichrist. Classic. By his teenage years, Crowley had fully embraced his role as the family rebel. In 1895, he entered Trinity College, Cambridge, but instead of studying, he invested his energy in poetry, mountaineering, and, you guessed it, the occult. In 1898, at age 23, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, an elite occult society where he learned ceremonial magic. This is where Crowley truly found his calling. He wasn't just dabbling anymore, he was all in. But gentlemen, life moves on. And in 1904, something happened that would change Crowley's life forever. He had just married a woman named Rose Edith Kelly, and they were honeymooning in Cairo, Egypt. There, over 3 days in April, Crowley claimed that a supernatural entity named Aiwass dictated him a text called the Book of the Law. This book proclaimed a new spiritual age and contained the famous phrase, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Essentially, do whatever you want became a religious commandment. Crowley named his new religion Thelema, declared himself a prophet, and from that moment on, considered himself the chosen messenger of this new age. Now, about his wife Rose. She was actually instrumental in this Cairo revelation. She entered trances, directed Crowley to ancient artifacts, and was acknowledged as the first Scarlet Woman of Thelema. A happy spiritual partnership, right? Well, not exactly. Over the next few years, their marriage fell apart spectacularly. They had 2 daughters, Lilith, who tragically died at age 2 in 1906, and Lola Zaza, who survived. Crowley later blamed Lilith's death on Rose's drinking. And Rose? She descended into severe alcoholism during their years together. Crowley didn't help. He publicly flaunted affairs and introduced Rose to various substances during magical rituals. By 1909, he divorced her. By 1911, Rose's drinking had become so uncontrolled that Crowley had her committed to an asylum for alcohol dementia. She never fully recovered. Rose died in 1932 at age 57, her life effectively ruined. And Crowley? He coolly noted her death in his diary with contemptuous comment, blaming her weakness rather than his own conduct. But my readers, did I tell you Crowley came from a wealthy family? Well, he did, and he used that wealth to fund increasingly extreme occult experiments. In 1920, he established his most ambitious and most infamous project, the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, Sicily. He and a small band of followers lived in a villa as a commune devoted to Thelema's principle of do what thou wilt. The abbey was decorated with explicit murals and operated with basically no rules. Free love, magic rituals, and total liberation from societal norms. Sounds like a disaster waiting to happen, right? You're absolutely correct. In early 1923, a 23-year-old follower named Raoul Loveday died at the abbey. Loveday died after participating in a ritual, possibly from drinking contaminated water. But his wife Betty May told a very different story to the London tabloids. She alleged that Crowley had made Raoul drink the blood of a sacrifice cat as a test of loyalty, and that Raoul fell ill and died shortly after. Crowley flatly denied this in court later, insisting there was no cat, no blood, and no drinking. But the damage was done. The British press erupted with stories of black magic at Crowley's Abbey. Headlines screamed about orgies, animal sacrifice, and death. Italy's government under Mussolini was so alarmed that they expelled Crowley from the country in April 1923 without even filing formal charges. Just get out. The abbey was closed. And the British press? They gave Crowley a nickname that would stick forever. The wickedest man in the world. Stop the video. I have something to say. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a new genre of YouTube videos that we are trying to mainstream. We are making literature and philosophy fun for everyone and not feel like a boring class. So please click on that like button and tell me who we should cover next or else. Crowley was now internationally infamous as a Satanist and black magician. Through the 1920s and early 30s, he wandered Europe broke, addicted to heroin, and increasingly isolated. He briefly married again in 1929, a Nicaraguan woman named Maria de Miramar, but that marriage was over within a year. She reportedly ended up in a sanitarium. By 1930, Crowley was declared bankrupt in London, but in 1934, Crowley made one last grand attempt to clear his name. Author Nina Hamnet published a memoir that casually mentioned Crowley's black magic orgies in Sicily. Enraged, Crowley sued her for libel. The trial in London was sensational. Crowley testified at length, insisting, "I have never practiced black magic. I never sacrifice animals or babies." Under cross-examination, the opposing lawyer mockingly invited him to demonstrate his magical powers. "Make yourself invisible in court." Crowley refused, looking either powerless or ridiculous. The defense brought up Crowley's own writings and past, effectively painting him as exactly what he claimed not to be. The jury found against Crowley. The judge labeled him one of the worst men in the world, and newspapers ran with headlines like "Black Magician Fails to Prove Innocence." The trial bankrupted him completely. From that point on, Crowley lived on the charity of followers. Broken. After the disastrous 1934 trial, Crowley spent his final years in decline. By the 1940s, he was living in a boarding house in Hastings, a seaside town in England. He was broke, suffering from chronic bronchitis and heart disease, and still heavily addicted to heroin, which he'd been using for decades, originally prescribed for his asthma, but long since spiraled into full addiction. He was essentially a shell of his former self, frail and forgotten by mainstream society. But even in his final days, Crowley couldn't stop being Crowley. His doctor, William Brown Thompson, had been treating him for years and prescribing him morphine. But in 1947, Dr. Thompson finally cut him off. No more drugs. Crowley was furious, and according to witnesses, as he lay dying, the enraged Crowley cursed his doctor. On December 1st, 1947, Aleister Crowley died at age 72. Respiratory infection, heart failure, decades of drug abuse. His body finally gave out. But here's where it gets eerie. Within 24 hours of Crowley's death, Dr. William Brown Thompson was found dead in his bathtub. Police concluded both men died of natural causes, but the press seized on the coincidence. Had Crowley's final curse actually worked? The wickedest man in the world, claiming one last victim from beyond the grave? The newspapers certainly thought it made for a good story. And then came the funeral. On December 5th, 1947, only about a dozen people attended Crowley's cremation in Brighton. One follower recited Crowley's own hymn to Pan, a poem full of pagan imagery and occult references. Newspapers immediately branded the ceremony a black mass, scandalizing the public. The local Brighton council was so alarmed they vowed to prevent any similar occult funeral from ever happening again. Even in death, Crowley caused controversy. His ashes were quietly shipped to an American disciple's garden in New Jersey, but the damage was done. His legacy as a dangerous occultist was sealed. So what happened to everyone else? His daughter Lola Zaza completely renounced him. She changed her surname when she married in 1934 and never spoke publicly about her father again. For over 150 years, some of Crowley's descendants didn't even know who their infamous ancestor was because the shame ran that deep. His son, Alistair Ataturk, lived under the shadow of a name he didn't choose and died in a car accident in 2002, having kept a low profile far from occult circles his entire life. His lovers? Leah Hersig, once his high priestess at the Abbey, left the occult world behind and spent decades teaching school in America, trying to escape the stigma. Rose died in an asylum, destroyed by alcoholism. And the legacy? Well, gentlemen, here's where it gets truly bizarre. The word sadism came from Marquis de Sade, but Crowley's influence on modern occultism is just as profound. His books were banned for decades, but by the 1960s, the counterculture embraced him. The Beatles put his face on the SGD Peppers album cover in 1967. Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page bought Crowley's old house. Timothy Leary praised him. Suddenly, the wickedest man in the world became a countercultural icon. Today, Crowley's religion Thelema is still practiced by thousands. Occult bookstores sell his tarot decks. Academics study him as a significant religious innovator. But at the same time, conservative and religious communities still condemn him as fundamentally evil. Some blame him for inspiring everything from satanic cults to Charles Manson, who quoted, "Do what thou wilt," his own twisted philosophy. I'll see you in the next one.